us right now via Zoom chat is retired Army Colonel Matt Dooley, 21 years in the Army, praise be to God, West Point grad, and a subject matter expert in robotics and artificial intelligence, and we're pleased to have him on the show this morning. Good morning to you, Colonel Dooley.
Hi, good morning, Joe.
Praise be to God. Thank you for your service, by the way. We are very grateful to you for that.
It's a privilege.
There were several stories in the news when I came back from vacation yesterday that I think were of great concern, and we wanted to have a conversation about what we might be expecting in 2022 from sort of an international perspective. Iran is launching rockets into space, and I'll never forget the years of warning about Iran practicing to deliver dirty bombs into our atmosphere. Is this a part of that? I don't know. Russia launching hypersonic missiles, a dozen of them, I think, recently. China has been launching hypersonic missiles. China has got AI technology now replacing prosecutors in a court of law, let alone using it to track American citizens or their own citizens. The spread of their social tracking system abroad is now taking a bigger pace. So what should we expect in 2022 from these actors, Taiwan, Russia, China, Iran, and more? Colonel Dooley.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. So we'll sort of take it in order. The Iranian program for their space launches is designed to do two things. One, to achieve the kind of prestige that any nation wants from having a space program. But the second one is the dual purpose of being able to launch a rocket that could put satellites into space, is also the same type of rocket that you could put a nuclear weapon on. So the idea of using a dirty bomb somewhere or importing a backpackable bomb into a country is not so threatening. When you talk about what it takes to infiltrate something like that by ground into a country, it's a threat. But it's something that's detectable and moves slowly. But an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, something that leaves our Earth's atmosphere, would enable a country like Iran to strike at us, like the Soviet Union threatened us during the Cold War. That's why a country with a dangerous regime in charge, like you see in Iran, having that kind of capability is a concern of ours. The second issue you brought up was the employment of hypersonic weapons, and I bring that as the next topic because they're related. A hypersonic weapon differs from an ICBM or a sub-launch ballistic missile in that it has a much lower attack profile. It doesn't leave our atmosphere, so it's not as detectable at an earlier time by our strategic radar. So an ICBM, you might have 20, 30 minutes worth of warning. A hypersonic missile with a lower attack profile and a faster speed at Mach 5 or faster comes at you closer to the horizon, and so you don't have the kind of early warning that you would have from detecting an ICBM launch. A country like China or Russia using a hypersonic weapon with a nuclear payload is a concern. We've had hypersonic missile technology for a while. The U.S. has since the early 2000s, worked at developing this kind of capability, but primarily for conventional purposes, using them as an operational or tactical weapon, kind of like a cruise missile that moves at Mach 5. The Chinese and the Russians want to develop that technology for a different purpose.
Colonel Dooley, do we currently have in our military a way to respond to this type of weaponry?
Yeah, it requires a different missile intercept capability. So it's this constant technology influencing tactics, tactics influencing technology that we've seen for decades. So we develop counters to hypersonic weapons. It just means you have to have missiles that are faster, or you have to have radars that detect it quicker so that you can respond to it. The issue is not, one or two of these weapons. The issue would be if you had hundreds of these weapons coming at you. Do you have defenses that are tight enough in your grid to stop them? It's a concern if you don't have that capability, but something I think that a country like the U.S. Fortunately can develop counters to. It's just going to take a while, and it takes some investment.
What can you describe for us what would happen if a dirty bomb, well, maybe you can just find terms. What is a dirty bomb and what would happen to us? What would be the impact if a dirty bomb were to be detonated in our atmosphere above the United States?
Well, yeah, you're talking about different applications of nuclear radiological weapons. So a nuclear weapon detonates, and whether it uses fission or fusion, destroys things by heat and light and blast over pressure. A dirty bomb is a conventional bomb that has a payload of radioactive elements. So what you're trying to do is put a dirty bomb at a location, detonate the conventional explosive, and then it contaminates the surrounding area with radioactive elements. So you lose access to the area, or you would at least have to spend millions cleaning up the area. So detonating a dirty bomb in a city doesn't necessarily destroy the city, it just contaminates it. Which is different than a nuclear weapon that creates a fission or fusion fireball.
So in that scenario, which is the scenario I've heard many talking heads comment upon and suggest that that's the one we have to worry about. Would you agree or disagree with that assessment? Do you think that is the main concern for us, or do you think with this hypersonic technology they can do far worse?
Well, it kind of depends on what you're talking about, what your strategic objectives are. A dirty bomb is an easier bomb to make if you're a terrorist, because you can get radioactive material from industry sources, and it's easier to assemble and then import to an area and contaminate it. You don't have to have something that's complex that creates a fission or a fusion response. So the dirty bomb scenario is one I see more likely to non-state actors, to terrorists. Hypersonic weapons are the kinds of weapons developed by state actors, countries like China or Russia. And you develop something like that to overwhelm, or to get underneath U.S. defenses. So it's a different scenario driven by different intent. But you also have to weigh in. When we talk about state versus state actor, China or Russia, attempting to deter us to do something, is the concept of deterrence. We have strategic weapons so that we can deter our enemies, our threats, our competitors from doing something that we don't want them to do, and they practice deterrence against us. So the development of hypersonic weapons is to create options for countries that want to do things and want to deter us.
Just super quickly, Colonel Dooley, I wanted to just touch off what you said last right before we went to the break, and that was the deterrent issue. One of the questions in my mind is these, like Russia, China, Iran, those type of main actors in these scenarios we discussed. Is their goal deterrent, or are they actually breathing threats? Because, are we going back to the Cold War where I got this many nukes, you got that many nukes, and I guess we're all just fine? Or is there a real concern, maybe amongst the terrorist groups, that they would launch such an attack against the United States? Just real quick, because I want to move on to artificial intelligence as well.
Yeah, you're asking, what motivates different threat groups. It's easier to understand a nation state as a rational actor because you've got a government, you have a leader, whether it's an autocrat or a democracy. You at least have a government that you're relating to that's accountable to its people. And so you can sort of weigh your options, whether they're deterrence in military terms, or economic deterrence, or diplomacy, in a way that's easy to understand in the Westphalian nation state concept. But when you're dealing with a non-state actor, a terrorist, you have to be concerned about what their ideological motivations are. So there's an expression in a movie that was done in the 1990s. I'm not concerned about a guy who has 5,000 nuclear weapons. I'm concerned about the guy who only wants one, because that person's going to use it. And they're going to use it for ideological reasons that may seem irrational to us. And so when I speculate to what different terrorist groups want to do, it's a different calculus than trying to understand what motivates a country like Russia or China.
I just wanted to switch over a little bit over to the AI question, and I for one welcome our robotic overlords, but but no, this is it's a serious issue that we're going to be facing very soon, and there's more and more. Me and my brother were talking about this over over Christmas, and we were watching Ready Player One and things like this, and it seems like the warfare is going to change dramatically in terms of way we fight wars. And I'm thinking particularly, I'm trying to think of the name of that movie when it was Live, Die, Repeat, and they Edge of Tomorrow, where people are battling in exoskeletons. You have other movies where they're piloting robots that are fighting wars instead. What does the progression of technology look like in terms of warfare?
That's a really good question. And it ties a lot into what I did towards the latter half of my military service and what I'm involved in now. You have to look at it from the U.S. military's perspective. Technology is an enabler, not a replacement. It is something that enhances your capabilities, but our intent is to not replace human beings one for one with robots, but to use robotics and AI to help us as teammates. There are some serious concerns about keeping human beings in roles that they shouldn't be in. So if we can use robots to take soldiers out of the dull, dirty, dangerous, and mundane tasks and have machines go do that, and then remission soldiers, remission key human leaders to go do other things, that's an area where we think there's some serious opportunity. But we're not creating Skynet or Terminator. Unfortunately, what you see in Hollywood does a lot to make the conversation difficult. Are we concerned about AI being used for the wrong purposes? Absolutely. Are there concerns about developing effective policies for justification of lethal autonomy, when you'll use it and when you won't use it? And more importantly, should something go wrong, how do you hold human decision makers accountable for those issues? Yes, we're having that conversation. We split the atom and spent 70 years chasing the consequences. The last thing we want to do is release AI with no accountability and no controls in place. However, we do have threats and near-peer competitors out there who don't have the same sort of Western morality model that frames how they might use AI. So that's our concern. The battlefield of the future will have lethal autonomy on it. So you better develop some policies in place, and you better develop some counters to it, because wishing it away is not an option.
Colonel Matt Dooley is our guest. We're talking about some of these big stories that are coming out. They came out toward the end of last year, but we're looking at them through the lens of 2022 and what our concerns ought to be. And I saw a story, I think it was just this morning, in fact, that China is using artificial intelligence to begin the process of replacing prosecutors in the court of law. And I find this very fascinating. If you're a criminal in China, how confident would you feel in the AI, fighting against you versus a human? It begs the question of, how much control will the humans have in the near future? China, in particular, is fond of using its technology to control its people on a mass level. And that technology is now being spread abroad. I know I think it was in Darwin, Australia, they've enacted their social sort of control systems. And now with COVID, they're using these systems to track its citizens all across the country and the world. So how much concern ought we to have? I know you touched on it a minute ago, but with these bad actors, is this going to get worse?
Yeah, I think the use of AI in a courtroom is a very interesting application. What you're talking about here is using AI as a decision-making aid, decision-making tool. Machines, AI will always be much better at just assimilating and crushing data. So if you had a program that could pull in, what the Chinese use a social credit score, what websites do you go to? What have you said? What have you posted on social media? To assimilate all that information to build a profile of you, to then justify a human judge making a decision about whether or not you're more apt to be guilty or less likely to be guilty of the charge that they've levied against you. AI could help you pull all that information together to build a case probably more efficiently than a human prosecutor. However, AI is not very good at making the sort of inferential reasoning that human beings are really good at, and pulling bits and pieces of information, data, and mitigating circumstances that might be useful in your defense. Do I think China cares about fair and just outcomes?
Right.
I don't think so. But the application of AI in that doesn't surprise me, in the idea of taking information and using a machine to help you process it to create an outcome.
You know, the banks in the world, JP Morgan Chase being one of them, I think Bank of America and others, the big banks, they're adopting these sort of social credit scores that China has developed, and they're using them to determine whether or not certain people are worthy of investments or worthy of loans. Do you see that? I see that as a double-edged sword. I see that as a downside and a dangerous slippery slope. How would you see that based on your experience?
I think the question is two things. What are the parameters in your algorithm? That's important. What's good versus what's bad? And then what's the purity of the data set? Garbage in, garbage out. If I don't put good information into the algorithm, then I don't have a actual true value outcome. So that's always a concern about how you build AI. There has to be a purity of the data set and an algorithm that makes sense. It's not a guarantee that it's always going to be the right outcome.
You know, Colonel Dooley, we have about 3 minutes left in our conversation, and you know, I highly recommend that people tune into Intersections on Monday. I produce that show for you and Bree on Monday mornings at 8 a.m. Central Time. And the one thing that y'all talk about often, and I think is a great thing to address right now, is what is the principles that we're looking at whenever we're developing AI and we're developing these kind of things that seem to be almost alive. Y'all were looking at a robot the other day that seemed to display human emotions, and this is, for one, it's uncanny. It's kind of scary. And the second thing, it brings up these issues. If we're creating what is seemingly life, what is that obligation that we have on these things that we're creating?
Well, first thing is just to have the conversation we're having now. You want to start talking about what are the outcomes, what are our responsibilities if we're successful in creating something that is truly sentient, and have that in place before you do it. Have the answers to those questions before you create it, rather than chase the consequences afterward. There's a way to do this, and doing it recklessly or without regard to the outcomes and what our responsibilities are is not how you do it. The good thing is we're having the conversation, and I don't care whether or not China or Russia have the conversation, at least we are. So we at least have a setup prior to creating that kind of intelligence.
Let me get this in there really quick here at the end. What about the metaverse? What are your initial thoughts about the metaverse? You got about a minute and a half.
Yeah. Again, another risk versus reward conversation. We create a metaverse, a virtual reality for folks to live in that's different from ours. What's the responsibility to humankind, and is it worth a pursuit? There's a discussion about whether or not you create an artificial world that everybody can work in. There's also discussions about life after death and uploading your conscience into a synthetic environment. There are serious moral issues that, you know, I like to say it like this. If it's wrong to do it without the technology, it's still wrong to do it with the technology. We don't have to be scared of the technology. We just have to ensure that we don't lose our humanity as we develop it. We already have some pretty successful rubrics that have been in place for thousands of years. Christ is a pretty good example. We can live as good Christians with technology or without it. But don't lose sight of what got us here as we create the technology.
Amen to that. Colonel Matt Dooley, thank you for your time today. God love you and God bless you. We're very grateful.
Thanks for having me. God bless.
All right, check them out on Mondays, 8 a.m. Central across the Guadalupe Radio Network with Bree Dale on Intersections, covering the big stories from both of their perspectives. It's quite interesting. You should tune in.